Hello everybody, it is March 29th, 2025. Sorry that I didn't make a video Wednesday for the third time in 2 months. My family got the norovirus, which is a fancy way of saying the stomach flu. So it was a little bit of a rough week. I was kind of hoping to make up for the video that I didn't post Wednesday yesterday, but I just had too much family stuff going on. You know, I work Sunday through Thursday. I got 2 days a week off, and that's a lot to catch up on. So Saturday is usually the day where I get the most free time to do anything. So didn't get to make up for that video this week, but next week I should have another video posted Wednesday. But anyways, I'm just gonna do a short one today. I just want to talk about pragmatism in Western leaders. I don't really have anything specific to talk about at the moment. I'm kind of waiting to see what happens with this supposed infrastructure ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and then also how things develop between Canada and the United States, Canada and Denmark in regards to Greenland, and how things develop in Europe, between the Ukrainian government and the American government and the EU. So I'm kind of waiting to see what happens in regards to these few things before I comment on them. But one thing I did want to talk about, though, is this distinct lack of pragmatism, of realistic governing in Western leaders, mainly people in the EU. And also it was under Biden here in the United States for those 4 years that he was in power. But I think what's happening in the EU is the Biden administration on steroids when it comes to incompetence in governing and not addressing some very serious internal issues in favor of preserving this grand ideological narrative. When you look at the EU, most politicians within the EU, and this is most politicians around the world at this point, ever since I say the military and political class became two completely different things. Not saying that this isn't a completely modern thing, but we do have this. It seems like throughout most of history, a lot of politicians had to have some kind of military career in order to become as influential as they ended up becoming. These were people that ended up with a lot of experience in some very practical things: organization, logistics, command structure, maintaining an army, having to learn at least some basic knowledge of dozens of different things to keep a campaign going. And they had to learn how to properly delegate and make pragmatic but also quick decisions. And I think it really set up a lot of leaders in the past for success. Look at somebody like, for example, Julius Caesar. Although he made some unfortunate political mistakes, he was a military genius. I think he was a bit too trusting of the people around him. I think he probably should have done some prescriptions, so to speak, of some certain senators if he wanted to stay in power. You can't really afford to be magnanimous in a position like his, or at least try to appear magnanimous in a position like his. Augustus had a little bit of military experience, but he was very good at delegating. Not much of a general, but again, he had enough experience, I think, firsthand, and enough open-mindedness where he knew how to select a good and competent military leadership, around him. You look at many of the kings throughout the Dark Ages, many leaders, just throughout, just take your pick, any point in history. A lot of great and famous leaders have some kind of military experience. Not all, but a lot of them do. Napoleon, for example, was somebody who was a military genius and a genius of logistics, at least for the first 2/3 of his career, before he started making some pretty terrible mistakes. But these men had real-world experience. They weren't just bureaucrats. They weren't just students that became ideologues, that grew up wealthy. A lot of these people, even if they did come from families with a little bit of wealth, they still had to claw their way up the social hierarchy to get to where they were. They had to, be in the trenches with their men, surrounded by the same pain and misery as a lot of their men. And today's ruling class, especially, and I'm just going to focus on the West. I mean, this is all around the world. I mean, most politicians now are just bureaucrats. They don't really have any real world military experience. But one of the reasons why this is such a problem in the West is, if you look at Europe now, so Europe is making all these grand, not a few specific European leaders. Keir Starmer comes to mind, where they're actually talking about sending troops to Ukraine and fighting the Russians. And I think what Keir Starmer is doing is he's trying to be Winston Churchill without understanding anything about Winston Churchill and the time in which Winston Churchill lived. He's not pragmatically looking at what his country's capable of militarily and economically. What industries do they have? What can they even produce? Where's their actual real standing in the world? It's kind of one of those things where I think some polls are taken, some advisors come in and say, well, we've talked to some of the old British boomers, and no offense to any of those people, but they seem to really hold Winston Churchill in high regard. So if you just kind of act like Churchill and talk about victory over the Russians and defending Europe, then maybe you'll become more popular. It'll increase your poll numbers and help the party out. And this is the problem. This is one of the issues Europe is facing, is because they look at what they think would be popular amongst their own populace without being in touch with their own populace at all anymore. I mean, this is a problem in France. This is a problem, definitely a huge problem in Germany, and a massive problem in Britain. I'll focus mainly on those three countries, but there's a reason why when polls are taken in any of these countries about the will to fight amongst the populace of these three nations, it's abysmally low. I believe it's 30% or less would want to actually fight to defend these governments or their nations in the way they exist now. There's no incentive to do so to them. There's massive social problems, massive economic problems. Many of these people are insanely unhappy with the decisions being made by their leadership. Their militaries are gutted. There's really no prestige in serving in the military anymore. I mean, you can have a fairly peaceful, non-expansionist nation and still hold military service in high regard and still maintain a strong military that makes people feel proud to be part of it. Unfortunately, the German army is a joke compared to what it used to be. The British military is an absolute joke compared to what it used to be. I mean, I've heard you could fit the entire military, all branches, within a soccer stadium. Which, if you're taking these grandiose postures against a nation that has now almost 4 years of experience in a high-intensity conflict, you just kind of look like a joke, especially when that military has, well over, I'm not sure what the size of the Russian military is, but it's got to be over, 1.5, 1.6 million, which how many hundreds of thousands of those are ground troops. But there's this complete disconnect, I think, between European leadership and European leadership with the reality that they're inhabiting. They're not willing to deal with any of their own internal issues. You look at a place like Ireland. Ireland has a pretty big problem with having a fairly large portion of its population feeling strong discontent towards the government, mainly due to their immigration policies. Okay, so why won't any of these leaders actually address these immigration policies? It's because they're wedded to this ideology that they have in regards to there not being people that compose a nation. You can basically just import anyone you want, and then they become German, they become British, they become French. I think the French overall maybe are a little more realistic about this and a little less receptive to it. But you look at a place like Germany. Germany will continue to import hundreds of thousands of people, regardless of the poor consequences in regards to social cohesion, regardless of how much the crime rates spike. It's again like this weird sort of globalist view of humanity where everything is interchangeable, there's no real culture, and you can just move to a land, not assimilate, not integrate, not speak the language, and then just become what that become what that people group is called. Right? Now, if you move from India and you move to Germany and you don't learn any German, you make no attempt to integrate into German society, well, you're not a German. You're living there, working, but you're not a German, and you can't import hundreds of thousands of people like this and then expect your native population to stand for it, even if there's not some kind of violent uprising from them against these policies. Many of these people are just checking out altogether. They're not interested in serving in the military. They're not interested in participating in social life or participating in public life. They're not interested in fighting for the country if it comes down to it. And many of these world leaders or European leaders are so wedded to this idea of multiculturalism, of globalism, that it is undermining their own country. So now they're in this position where they feel it is time again to fight another European war, but they head countries that they have managed so poorly because they're not managing them from a pragmatic and realistic mindset. They're looking at everything as ideological. It's like, okay, we have to get rid of the heavy industry because we have to preserve the environment. Okay, we have to get rid of any feelings of like strong national identity because that's a thing of the past, and we're trying to get away from that. We want to be this global nation of mankind and all live together and hold hands. But that's not how human beings operate. Whether you like it or not, that's not an ideological statement from me. That's a statement of fact. Again, human beings like to live together with other human beings that have a similar culture, language, religious view, even all along ethnic lines. That's how we are. Now, that's not saying that you can't have a multi-ethnic society and it function well. Believe it or not, despite what is said about the United States and despite what the media reports on, the United States does function reasonably well in many cases as a multi-ethnic society. Now, it's not perfect, but believe it or not, most people in the United States, regardless of ethnicity, generally get along pretty well. I'm not saying everybody gets along, but for the most part, people can work side by side with someone of a different religious background or of somebody of like a different ethnicity, somebody from a completely different culture, and generally speaking, we get along pretty well because there's this overarching idea of being an American that encompasses everybody that wants to integrate to it. And many people in America that move here do integrate into it reasonably well. So it is possible to have a society like that, but you need some kind of strong identity for everyone to become a part of. It doesn't have to be strictly along ethnic lines, but there needs to be some kind of social cohesion if you want to have a stable country. And European leaders, especially in Germany and the UK, have completely abandoned the idea. Like you can have you can bring large amounts of people in, say from a completely different religious and ethical background than the population that's already in your country, and throw them together with no attempt to integrate one into the values of the other. Like no attempt to integrate the group that's coming in into the values of the people that are already there, and then expect them to just get along and have a normal functioning system. It's just creates chaos. Any leader from the past that would look at a situation like that would say, okay, this is not feasible, this is not going to work, we can't govern like this, we have to govern responsibly and pragmatically, and we have to address the concerns of our own citizenry, or we're going to be out of power and our country is going to fall into chaos. And if you truly loved your country, then you would want to govern it in a way that preserves it, protects it, and makes sure that it's healthy. And Western Europe is not being governed in a way that makes their societies healthy and stable. And many liberals that live in Europe are kind of decrying this rise of like European populism or like right-wing parties in Europe. What's a natural consequence to the way that Europe has been governed? The pushback that Keir Starmer is getting in the UK is not a result of just Russian interference or online right-wing trolls inflaming racial hatred. Like there are some serious problems that have been simmering beneath the surface of the British or society in the United Kingdom for decades now that just hasn't been dealt with in a real pragmatic way because the people in charge do not govern pragmatically. They have an idea, they have an ideology, they have a world they want to build, and everything has to fit into that framework. And that framework, again, creates chaos. It creates misery. It creates unnecessary social tension and social strife. So then what you end up with is an incredibly dysfunctional society that doesn't have a very good industrial base because you've gutted it in favor of environmentalism. And what's funny about Europe never had to gut itself, never had to gut its industry. It could have fully embraced nuclear power. Germany could have cut back seriously on emissions and got rid of its coal plants in favor of nuclear power. But again, they're so wedded to this idea of like green energy, and this assumption that, okay, well, we can just get rid of all of our heavy industry, and we can use technology and AI to compensate for all of it. We can create this insanely generous social welfare state that compensates for the unemployment, compensates for people not having jobs in these sectors, and we can just create this perfect, happy society, just kind of throw things at the wall until they stick. There's no real plan to do this. It's an idea that has existed in Western thought, I'd say probably since the Enlightenment, at least since the early 20th century, to build this perfect society. Much of it does come out of communism. I'm not saying these people are communists in the same way that Marxists in the early 20th century were communists, but they're definitely influenced by some of those ideas, especially about creating a better economic system and a perfect society. And they've gotten to the point now where they are willing to sacrifice the well-being of large portions of their own citizenry to get there, because these people aren't along with the idea. They're not ideologically wed to the same things as they are. They're holding on to these outdated ideas of the past, and I think governments in Germany and the United Kingdom have resolved themselves to ignore these people, I guess, until they die off or go away, which is, again, if you're governing from a pragmatic standpoint, you have a large portion of your population that's consistently unhappy with the political decisions that you're making, and a younger generation of your own citizens are becoming increasingly unhappy with the political decisions that your government is making, then the assumption shouldn't be that, well, eventually these old bigoted people will just die off. They won't. The numbers of people that feel extreme discontent are only going to grow until it becomes a tidal wave that these people can't stop, and then there's just no working with them anymore. They're just going to want them out, and there's no negotiating with them. You're gone. That was a phenomenon that happened in the United States that led to the second term of Donald Trump. A lot of former Democrats and liberals ended up voting for Trump out of pure disgust for the current state of the American Democrat Party, and that's happening in Europe. You have a lot of people that probably had been labor voters most of their lives that look at the state of the Labor Party now and Keir Starmer and the things that he's doing and say, well, this is insanity. I need to vote for reform. I'm not saying reform is the best option over there. It doesn't seem to be, but I mean, it's a spite vote against the people that you think are most dangerous. And there are masses of people that voted for Donald Trump for the same reason, out of reaction to the sheer incompetence and lunacy coming out of the Democratic Party. They voted for the other guy, despite his flaws and despite his faults. That's going to happen across Europe, whether these people like it or not, specifically Western Europe. And they can't label everybody as a far-right fascist, especially when you have people that have been self-avowed liberals for their entire lives now voting for opposition parties. If they do not learn how to deal with their societies and civilizations in a pragmatic way and govern from a pragmatic standpoint, then they're going to have a complete social upheaval that changes these governments completely and totally, and to maybe something that does resemble this far-right monstrosity that they're afraid of. But if it does happen, I would say at this point it's their own fault. If you look at Weimar Germany, was governed incredibly incompetently. Europe after World War I was a complete mess, and I'm sure there were people warning that if this isn't dealt with in a more pragmatic, less punitive way, then Germany is going to end up in the same position that it was. There's going to be some kind of pushback from the other side, and resurgence in German nationalism. And of course there was. I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it was inevitable, like an inevitable consequence. I don't know why I can't talk today. Well, that's how I look at things politically. It's regardless if it's good or bad. If your policies are terrible, there is going to be inevitably some kind of pushback against it, and you're going to have some severe consequences that you just can't get away from. And I think it's very crucial that Western European leaders and politicians learn this very quickly. Many of these situations, like the UK, can be turned around without a revolution. It's not too late if some of these leaders wake up and start making better decisions. Same with France, same with Germany. But once there's a certain tipping point is met, where things are so butchered, beyond repair, revolution is going to be the only option that these countries have, and revolutions are often very bloody, very violent, destructive, deadly. Societies break down, everything's chaos. If that could be avoided, if a country can be fixed through pragmatism and compromise before it ever reaches that point, that is almost always the best road to take. And I don't know if Western Europe will be able to turn the ship around before it gets to that point. We'll see, but I'm not entirely confident that these people will learn their lessons in time. And then the same thing militarily. Some of the statements made by Western European countries in regards to a conflict with Russia are laughable. They're not taking into regards rates of production. They're not taking into account how many tanks they can actually produce a year to make up for losses. Okay, Germany has a few hundred Leopards, a few hundred Leopard 2s. France has a few hundred Leclercs. Okay, Russia lost all of that in the first year or two of the war and has probably replaced most of those tanks by now. Europe doesn't have any heavy industry anymore. If it gets into a slugging match with a much larger neighbor that has equipment loss rates comparable to World War II, they wouldn't last a day. Somebody has to realize that. I don't know if, again, like none of these people don't seem to understand logistics, economics. They don't really understand anything in regards to military matters. And I think even most of the generals serving in these high positions in these countries don't either, because they've never actually served in a war. They've seen war games, they look at data on spreadsheets, and they kind of go off of that, or simulations or assumptions. Our tanks are just inherently better because they have a higher crew survivability rate, and the armor is better. Therefore, we'll win the war. I'm pretty sure Germany in 1944 had the same mindset when it came to the Tiger 1s and 2s. Well, who won that war? It wasn't Germany. But anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'll be back Wednesday with another video. Not really sure what I'm going to talk about yet. We'll kind of wait and see what develops in the news, and I will be back. So everybody have a good day.